you read my handwriting?
Apparently not.
LB. LB.
Right.
Your emergency blanket and your light. Your glow stick. You're ready to go. And you go ahead and smile. One more set. Rachel L. Where's Rachel? Rachel L. Emergency blanket and glow stick. You're set. All right. Now that we got your attention with prizes.
I woke us up.
That first unit that I taught was the only one that is adapted for our Northern California area. The rest of your modules are going to follow your workbook. So if you'll turn to Module 8 in your workbook, we'll go through most of this material. Some of it is covered in the video, and I don't want to belabor this point. And we have all been involved or heard about or read, seen, or actually experienced events of terrorism and civil unrest in the last 10 years or so. Module 8 starts with 8.
Say like 1.
Uh-huh.
That would be section 4, 5. There you go. 8. And go back.
Right. So this module talks about awareness of events that we might experience, hear about, or be involved in inadvertently because we're on vacation on a train in Europe, or we might be in Southern California at a major fun place like Disneyland or Knott's Berry Farm, or you might be visiting family back east where they have major population centers that might be affected. Their trains, planes, buses, tourist activities, concerts, those kinds of things are targets of opportunity for folks who intend to do harm, to create an act of terrorism, which is designed to put fear and disrupt our economy as well as our way of life. And so we want to be aware of it. But as CERT team members, and I'll say this several times, you're not a first responder, unless you really are, of course. But generally, you are not a first responder because a terrorist act is a crime scene. It's generally a law enforcement handled activity as far as the response. They bring in the fire department, should there be fire or other danger, EMS for any injuries and so on. Our most recent event was the Boston Marathon, the bombers. But it was some citizen identification of those people who were doing those activities, the young men who had the backpacks that dropped them off in the crowds that injured so many people. They were quickly caught, surveillance cameras along the route. People who said, I saw that guy walk up, he dropped a backpack and walked away from it. He says, what the heck? And then it went off. That guy lost a leg. But he remembered thinking, something's really unusual. Why is he doing that? That's not right. What is he thinking? It's that intuitive sense that something is not right. And you as an individual and as a CERT team member can pay attention to your intuitions. You can be aware of what's going on around you. You can know what is normal. It may be unusual for me, but it might be normal for this area. I don't know. But you do know. You know where you live. You know what you see every day. So what are those boxes in the corner? Is that okay? Is that not okay? Should we be paying attention to that? I don't know. But Sue told me that's the Easter supplies and stuff they're going to put away in the storage shed. Okay, I'm good with that. So what we're going to talk about is not necessarily you as a first responder going to a terrorist activity and controlling that scene. What you're going to do is you're going to stay safe. You're going to step away or secure the crime scene for law enforcement. And you're going to make other people aware of the hazard and the dangers if you think there is something going on. And more importantly, you are going to report what you know to those officials at 911. The movie that I have talks about calling the CIAC, that's CIAC, which stands for the Information Assessment Center. And this movie was prepared by Orange County, who is certainly much more aware because of their location in California, Southern California. might be followed as terrorist activities because they have a port of entry, they have a major airport, they have a major lifeline from Mexico north, and they have a lot of visitors because of the tourist venues that are located in that general area of California. So, before we start here, I just want to say, U.S. CERT team members want to be aware, you want to know how to report, and you want to stay safe. And those are the critical pieces, no matter what else you learn out of this unit. We're going to cover some of the basic things that might be used as modes of activity for a terrorist unit, the types of explosives and that kind of thing. But primarily, we just want you to be aware. That's your real job. So we're defining, identifying the targets, talking about the kinds of signs of terrorism that you're going to see. And we're going to talk about what you might do as a CERT team. Basically, isolate an incident, step away, stay safe, warn others. And we're also going to be able to describe some actions following a suspected terrorist incident. So in your book, these same topics should be listed there, talking about what is terrorism, the targets, weapons, CBRN. We're going to talk about the indicators, the chemical, the biological, radiological, nuclear, and explosive things that might be used to create events. How to prepare yourself, which you have just had a 3-hour module on, and then CERT teams and terrorist incidents too. So the FBI definition, and I believe this is on your page H2, unlawful use of violence against persons or property to intimidate and coerce the civilian, government or civilian population or any segment thereof in furtherance of political or social objectives. And that's the legal definition for use in prosecuting people who do terrorist acts. So that tells us what they're trying to do is intimidate us and make us scared so that we don't do our normal activities, disrupting us. And they may have an economic impact because businesses will close down or be damaged. So they're creating havoc wherever they go, and they intend to do that to make us scared so that they get us to do what they want. So we need information about what we need to do so that we can not only fight back in a way that keeps us safe, but also limits the things that they can do because we are aware that they are out there and the things that we are aware of in our own community to keep the normal as a standard. So a few people can do a lot of damage, kill a lot of people, more easily than any other time in history, and can cause multi-millions of dollars of damage too, with explosives mainly, as well as limiting people's movements because now you're afraid to go on the train or you're afraid to go on vacation because you've seen some activity and you don't want to be involved in that kind of thing. So that disrupts the economy as well. It can be a problem all the way around. Everybody's seen pictures of 9/11, and then the Murrah building, Oklahoma City in the 1990s, was the other local, or I don't say local, but the in the United States in 1995. And I still remember the day I heard about that because I have relatives in Oklahoma, and it was really very terrifying to think that anybody that I knew might be involved in that. Fortunately, that was not the case. But our terrorist goals are to make mass casualties, to have a loss of official and critical resources like hospitals that are damaging our water supplies, our transportation lifelines, upsetting kids from going to school, all those kinds of things that upset everybody. What if your kid can't be in school and you can't go to work? And, the cascade effect happens on down the road until the issue is resolved. It primarily, though, heightens fear and brings resources. And one of the favorite things of terrorist groups nowadays is to create a diversion or a bombing, and once all the first responders get there, to set off another one to kill those people who are responding. And then we're left without professional responders. So the more you can be aware of things and stop them from happening in the first place, the better. targets might be government, key industries, bridge, subway, tunnels, others, water supplies, utilities. You may not be a terrorist target here, but you may be impacted, as we talked about earlier, because your transportation lifelines no longer can bring resources to you. You may not be able to get to medical care that you need for your own health. All kinds of things can happen if you start to think about places that you normally go, things that you do on a day-to-day basis, can be disruptive, which would be definitely a problem. So, lessons we've learned from international attacks. We're not invincible, obviously. The first time the United States was ever attacked since the Revolutionary War, that is, in 9/11. We learned that we're vulnerable, unfortunately. The terrorists have an ideology that promotes hatred of Western beliefs, and that's unfortunate because that would be us, right? More and more incidents are happening. More and more plots are uncovered and foiled. A large segment of our population is at risk, especially those in ports of call where you have airports, major transportation hubs for trains, planes, or others. And the incidents are becoming more and more daring, more lethal, like the bombing for the Boston Marathon. And we know that observant citizens can be part of that solution because eyes and ears on the ground also really does make a difference. And we don't have to leave it just to the one law enforcement officer for our whole area who has a very large area. Now we have all 20 or so of you paying attention to what's going on every day and around you. So the laws that they violate, all of these, I believe, are also listed in your book. And it's just about every law there is, every type of law, and every humanitarian law as well, because they're injuring innocent people and children. It makes a huge difference because we don't know what's coming next. We have already screens at our airports, although I'm not sure that anybody else has tried to set their underwear on fire or shoe bombings, but at least we have that protection of knowing that people are being checked and the terrorists are on alert, that we have a system for screening so that those who might try to harm us have a more difficult time of it. I talked earlier about CBURN. CBURN is an acronym that's used for the types of weapons that one might use if you were a terrorist and wanted to do harm. Chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear, and high-yield explosives. I think that's on your page 4. Is it listed?
Yep.
Did I have it right?
A4.
So these are the 5 categories, and most weapons fall into these categories in one way or another. The thing that you need to be aware of is the types of things that fall under chemical. The ones that we see the most of are probably tear gas, riot control agents are available, capsaicin, like bear spray, that kind of thing can be used too. The blister agents, blood agents, and the others are more difficult to get because they're more toxic and they're regulated and they're more difficult to deal with on a day-to-day basis. If you as an individual are trying to deal with them, they have to be containerized and you would be putting yourself in harm's way actually if you tried to work with those. The biological weapons, generally the routes of exposure inhalation would be like the anthrax or a gas, a chlorine gas, or absorption. Some of our chemicals that have been used on crops and so on before they found out how toxic they were to humans and animals. Those kinds of things are the things that have been used in the past and are not seen as much nowadays because they are difficult and they only work in a small area. Unless they're put into our water or some other food source. Radiological weapons, the ones that you might see in this area are actually the industrial cameras that are being used to monitor the bridges and roadways. They're x-raying those facilities and roadways as well as the sewer lines and the water lines to be sure that they're secure. So the things generally for radiological are easy to identify because they're the medical components like radioactive iodine for testing and so on, but they come in very small quantities. So they're not typically used by terrorists who are doing things except to place them in bombs to make them a dirty bomb, to contaminate people with the fragments of radiological waste and contaminate people so that they're getting an overdose of radiation. But in most cases, those are also in small supply and they're difficult to get a hold of unless you're working in that field, and they're difficult to disperse to make bombs and to also impact a large number of people. So it'd be in a radiological situation, unless you had the fissionable plutonium or other materials for a nuclear explosion, you're probably not going to see that happen with a terrorist weapon in this area. My other instructor, I'm not sure where he saw that sign, but it was a good one. No drugs or nuclear weapons allowed inside. Thank you very much. I like that one too. Nuclear weapons obviously have an extremely high impact if you had an explosion of a nuclear type. But as I said, even though the risk is very high, the incidence is very low based on the ability to get it. The main thing to know if you're ever exposed is that those after effects are very difficult to track, because unless you know exactly how much of an exposure you got, or the fact that your body is contaminated with radiological material, then you probably are not going to know what those effects are unless you can be monitored. And those are long-term monitoring situations, too. What we see the most of are the high-yield explosives. We generally see explosives, grenades, they are laced with nails or other materials that can cause penetrating injuries. Plastic explosive can be obtained. Military munitions are oftentimes the sources, like grenades and mortars and so on. Some of them, of the IEDs, everybody's heard of an IED now, thanks to the war in Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan. Yeah.
Improvised explosive device.
Those are oftentimes the highest use and the highest risk for us is to be impacted by bombs, and that has indeed been the case in the last few incidents in the U.S. But those components are on the internet. How to build bombs, it's easy to find out about. Battery switch, igniter, explosives, that's all we need. And a little bit of guts to put it together. So assessing our risk, our nuclear risk is less, the impact's good, it's high, but the possibility of it happening is probably all the way down to high-yield explosives, which the possibility is the highest, and it's the greatest risk for us because we have the potential for being in situations where those things might be placed on a train, on a plane, on a boat, wherever. A large population gone to a concert, gone to softball games, any of those kinds of things where you have large groups of people, where someone could use that as an example to do harm. So our 8 signs of terrorism are surveillance, which means that the terrorist group or person is surveilling, looking at the area, checking it out, checking to see what's going on. And it may not happen here so much as it is if you're in another more populated area where you see people surveilling the water treatment plant, for instance. Why are they doing that? Or at transportation hubs, boat stations, trains, planes, airports, and so on. Elicitation means they're asking questions. They're eliciting information from people who work there or live nearby. Well, what time does that bus arrive? Well, what time does that plane take off? When does the UPS man come? When does the garbage get picked up? All those kinds of things that they would need to know if they're planning a visit there. Talking about testing the security, seeing what happens if they hit the fence or try to get through an armed area, that kind of thing. Funding, they need lots and lots of money to do a major terrorist act because they need the weapons, they need the people, they need the getaway car, so to speak. And so funding is necessary, so they have to have some way of funding the activities that they're doing. They need to acquire their supplies. They also need to be able to impersonate someone and maybe using disguises. So if you see people impersonating others or suspicious and it's not Halloween, ask questions. Find out what's going on. In the tests of security, they sometimes will use the disguises or change their appearance so that they can't be identified. Oftentimes, they do rehearsals or dry runs, and that actually was how several of the terrorist groups from 9/11 were caught. There were additional activities planned but not carried out because people turned in and noticed that something was going on. So we know that that also can happen. And then the last one is deployment, where the individuals who have prepared all of these things and are ready to do this act actually go into action. Sort of like Mission Impossible, where you hear they all get together, okay, you're going to do this, you've got it timed down to the minute, everybody goes out and does their thing. Unfortunately, some of them are suicide bombers, and those folks apparently are not going to come out of that alive, they don't care. And unfortunately, that's how many of them are carried out, and folks can be severely injured because the person who is doing that act is going to do it no matter what. And they don't care about their own lives, and they don't care about your life. So that's why you really need to be paying attention about whether things happen or about to happen. If anything unusual is happening, report that. Attacks might include vapor clouds, mist, could be unscheduled spraying. I think that was written for areas where they have crop dusting more than anything else. Talking about, I don't know that there's anything of that sort going on in this particular area, and I'm not familiar with it either. Materials or equipment that are unusual for the area, lots and lots of boxes or bags being left by the roadside or something like that. Out of place or unintended packaging, those kinds of things may or may not be part of it. Unusual odors, taste, or things that you can see, feel, or hear, that are not usual for your area. Some of the other things, let's see, would be chemical fires. It may test and see what the wind directions are, toxic odors. You might happen upon a lot of terrorist literature or manuals or something right out in the open or in a car, or if you rent a hotel, they may have left them behind. Those are the things which you tip off. Bomb-making manuals, that's a real tip-off. And selling of stolen property, and often obtained with bogus credit cards. Well, you may not have so much of that in Happy Camp, but in the Bay Area and some of the other larger population centers, they see a lot of it, unfortunately. And that's not necessarily terrorist, but also drug activities and some other things. So it all ties together. Seaborne indicators. That's a pipe bomb example in a suitcase. So the pipe bomb is there, and they have a detonator that's triggered by a radio signal. So those things are very common. You see them in movies and on TV, and they actually do exist as a means of explosives on trains and planes. And then the other are weapons caches, obviously, that have been set aside either for use by the terrorists or to sell to acquire funding. So physical signs. You worried me there with the dead fish and the balls there, because some of those signs might be tests of biological weapons that will kill fish in the pond. Yeah. That's a biological weapon.
Neurological agent.
Yeah. Or large numbers of people all having breathing problems. Go to the clinic and say, I don't know what's going on, but maybe the truck going down the road is releasing some fumes or something that's affecting a large number of the population. Multiple casualties without any obvious signs of trauma. Someone comes to the school and all of a sudden all the personnel are lying on the ground because of a gas that's released of some sort, or maybe they've been asphyxiated because there's no air. You don't know. So those kinds of things can be indicators as well, aside from the fact that you may have had an incident with your gas supply, you've got no air, and you're getting asphyxiated. So unless you have one of these suits, anybody have one of these at home? Handy dandy. All right. Yeah. Painting contractors, people who work on auto bodies and sometimes have these, the full-fledged respirators, but you're not equipped to go and be a first responder. So what we want you to do is to be safe and remember that terrorist sites are crime scenes as well. So that means that you need to protect and preserve the evidence. You need to be able to isolate so that nobody else goes in and causes any harm or is harmed by any activity that's there. And you want to call first responders and let them know what's going on and take good notes so that you can tell the 911 dispatcher what's happening. Because in this area, you may wait a couple hours before you can get that hazmat team over here. If in the same day, you just don't know what's going on elsewhere. And so being able to isolate and secure a facility and keep everybody else safe is the primary role for the CERT trained individual. I think probably, let's see, I'm going to stop and show you the movie because the rest of this is included in the little video that I have. And I think that would make more sense. Then we can do a little bit of review here. Pardon my clunky system, but this seems to work.
These disturbing images are artifacts left to us by individuals and groups that use violent tactics to further their goals and agendas. We can help assure safety by learning how to identify the tactical indicators of terrorist threats. But information about their tactics is not enough. If you can observe the indicators of terrorist activity and also know how to report them, you can stop terrorist activity before deadly action takes place. To be a witness to possible terrorist activity will mean that you will have to assess the risk of terrorist activities in your community. How do you identify terrorism behavior? Anyone could be a terrorist. The key is not to focus on who, the race, ethnicity, gender, or religious beliefs of those we think might be involved in suspicious activities, but rather to focus on identifying the behaviors. The following video focuses on behaviors that are commonly observed in terrorist activities. Okay, I want you to make an assessment of your area's vulnerability to terrorism. Are there groups operating there who have an agenda that uses violence as a means to achieve their objectives? Is there a supportive population for these groups? Are there indications of outside radical influences in your community? What sites in your area have importance as possible targets? Now, keep these questions in mind as we look at the tactical indicators. A word of caution. Every terrorist group operates differently. The differences arise from the geographic origins of the group's objectives, a supportive population, and the presence of targets. These observable tactical indicators have been put into the following categories: finance, surveillance, elicitation, tests of security, acquisition of supplies, suspicious persons, a dry run or trial runs, and the deployment of assets. Now let's look at these tactical indicators as you assess how they might apply to your area. Behind every terrorist stands a complex network of people and organizations that have to fund the enterprise. Someone has to buy and pay for every single dimension of bringing off a murderous plot. Some of the ways that terrorists raise money are through religious donations, clandestine donations, internet funding, legal businesses, typical crimes, sophisticated crimes, drug sales, and other scams. Here's an example. In North Carolina, an off-duty deputy sheriff observed many large purchases of cigarettes and the buyers heading north out of state after the purchases. When his observation was reported to federal authorities, it resulted in a large investigation of interstate cigarette smuggling that was tied to Hezbollah, a group that before 9/11 was responsible for more deaths of U.S. persons than any other terrorist organization. The smugglers would buy cigarettes in North Carolina, a state with low taxes on tobacco, and sell them to retailers in a state with high taxes, in this case Michigan, eventually earning over $8 million. Credit card fraud, counterfeit goods, to include electronics, and identity theft are all preferred methods of raising funds, high profit and lower risk than some other crimes. Look for people living well above or below their means, and also those unwilling to explain their income or those who seem overly interested in our own regulatory or investigative activities, strategies, or techniques. Surveillance is the monitoring of activities in order to identify and document a target's details to enable a plan of attack.
The sign of issuing a manifestation, U.S. military personnel will drop off on the bus and will walk towards the MRT station. Our bicycle can be parked there also, either bicycle or motorcycle. You will notice that some of the boxes that are placed on the motorcycles, these are the same type of boxes which we intend to use.
Here are some ways that surveillance can be carried out. Taking video and photographs of a site or potential target. Note-taking about site details and scheduled activities. Diagrams of access roads or building configurations. Maps of pertinent site coordinates. The use of vision-enhancing equipment to observe fine details. If someone is paying undue attention to a potentially critical area or building, think about why this might be happening. Check out their story. Look for other coincidences that might give this event a deeper significance, and document your observations. However, it's not just taking video or annotating maps. It's what this information could be used for that counts. Ask the next question. What is it for? And what could they do with it? Elicitation is a methodology to gather information. It's one of the ways that terrorist groups get intelligence. Secure information should be guarded, and when elicitation occurs, it should be noted and reported. Elicitation techniques can be employed using fax, mail, email, telephone, as well as face-to-face conversations, especially at or near potential target facilities. Questions may not be direct. Watch what you say. Be skeptical and inquisitive about the sources of inquiries. Find out the reason why the information is being sought and report it. Tests of security, also known as probes, are the ways that terrorists can test the strength of any security system. It may measure reaction time or try to penetrate security barriers or identify security personnel, equipment, training, or capabilities. What might appear as a simple break-in or strange occurrence could be a probe to gather intelligence. Umar Farouk Abdul Muttalib, the underwear bomber, could also represent a test of airline security to see what type of attack could be successful against new procedures and equipment. A failed attack may actually be part of a test, even if the attacker is unwitting. Never stop asking, what if, even if you know what happened. The acquisition of supplies involves purchasing or stealing weapons, ammunition, explosives, radioactive or hazardous materials, and can include acquisition of hospital, military, and law enforcement uniforms, as well as identification materials, keys, and key cards. In general, it involves materials that will enable an attack. Persons using stolen uniforms and stolen or fictitious IDs can gain access to facilities, and many areas which may seem secure are actually vulnerable to breach by way of simply wearing the right uniform or having a key. Here's an example of how terrorists support the violent activities of their organizations. Rockmont Abdir was arrested in Sunnyvale, California, and charged with conspiracy to provide material support and actual material to terrorists. He was also charged with contributing goods and services to a specially designated global terrorist, Zulkifli Abdir of Jemaah Islamiyah. Jemaah Islamiyah is an Al-Qaeda-linked terrorist group in Southeast Asia, most famous for the 2002 Bali bombing. Rockmont allegedly used fake names and addresses and even emails written in code. He sent about $10,000 to buy guns and sent packages to Zulkifli filled with equipment, food, and even news stories of his activity. Federal agents also found ammunition, sniper scopes, military training manuals, and other equipment in Rockmont's home and storage space. Again, ask the next question. Not just the what, but what could it be used for? A burglary, a robbery, or stockpiling of unusual materials may have a more sinister meaning. Your attention should be roused by the observation of people who do not normally belong in places of work, campuses, businesses, stores, hospitals, medical offices, and government buildings. This could include out-of-place delivery trucks, messenger services, or seemingly lost individuals.
Show me pin code of vehicles for me on 176.
In 2007, Ahmed Mohammed and Yusuf Megan were questioned by deputies who stopped them for speeding near the site of a naval weapons station and military prison where enemy combatants have been held. Deputies saw suspicious movement in the car as the men were concealing a laptop computer. And when questioned, the two men couldn't immediately say what they were doing in the area or where they were going.
So how'd you get here? This is a long way from 95. Jacksonville is Florida. For one place, so they don't have a beach. Number two, now many people get up at 2 o'clock in the morning in Tampa, drive 14 hours and only make it 5.5 hours. Number three, you don't have reason to go to North Carolina, you just go just to go. That's kind of out of the ordinary. Get up into North Carolina and back by the time all the time is in. What do you have to do, Mr. Brown? Anything this vehicle we should know about? Anything this vehicle we should know about? Guns, knives?
Alert deputies found in the car what the bomb squad later determined to be pipe bombs. Their laptop computer contained a 12-minute video showing how to turn a remote-controlled toy into a bomb detonator. Never be content with the immediate event. There is always more to the story. Keen observation, asking probing questions, and discovering inconsistencies can thwart terrorist plots. A dry run is a rehearsal of an attack. People move around according to a plan, perhaps to prepare for a kidnapping or bombing, working out the timing and actions of all the components. Associated with this can be mapping out of routes and include timing of security patrols, ship changeovers, and even traffic lights. Is this a critical facility that is being tested for vulnerability or mode of attack? Investigate further if possible, and file a report. These images are taken from a militia training video and demonstrate dry run scenarios as planned to be waged against law enforcement agencies here in the United States. This is a dry run of an attack and tactical operations against our government. This particular anti-government militia group has been conducting military-style training and is accused of conspiring to levy war against the United States. Authorities said the militia planned to kill an unidentified local law enforcement official, then attack the funeral with improvised explosive devices and foreign projectiles. Whether it is a militia group practicing for a future war against the government, or an unruly airline passenger causing a flight crew response, dry runs and rehearsals are happening all the time, but it is up to you to report them. The deployment of assets is the actual placement of people and supplies into positions to commit an attack.
It was just before 12:30 July the 21st, 2005. The rush hour was over. It was a beautiful day. The tube was half empty. Then the CCTV camera catches a man with a rucksack. It's Ramzi Mohammed, his left hand in his pocket where the prosecution says he had a battery to detonate a bomb. And suddenly he looks behind him. Everyone else on the carriage jumps at the explosion and starts to panic, leaving the carriage by the end door.
Knowing or predicting where terrorists may deploy their personnel and assets may help us interdict an attack before it gets to the level of what you see here. Look for the signs, know the indicators, and prevent the attack. Let's review the pre-incident indicators one more time. Finance, surveillance, elicitation, tests of security, acquisition of supplies, suspicious persons, a dry run or trial runs, and the deployment of assets. Report tips and leads regarding any of the indicators we talked about to your agency's Terrorism Liaison Officer, TLO. The TLO is an individual that serves as a conduit of information and main point of contact for a public safety agency in matters related to terrorism intelligence. If your agency does not have a TLO program, you can contact your Regional Intelligence Fusion Center directly to report suspicious activity.
It is a message I can leave everybody with, is that don't take anything for granted. If you see something, report it, even if you think it's insignificant.
That's right. Be proactive for the safety of your community. You can be proud that you are becoming informed about terrorist tactics and an active observer of possible threats. It's an ever-changing landscape with new players and new threats. Stay vigilant. Stay informed. If you see something, say something.
So where is your kayak here in Humboldt County or in Kissimmee County? There is no such thing, is there? You call 911 and you also talk to anybody else that you know that is involved in first response and let them know what you need to do. So on these, in fact, there'll be a moment here for technological help. We're finding you full screen. There we go. Applause, please. Thank you, thank you. So, preparing for terrorist activities. That movie was created by Orange County, as I said, but it covers a lot of this module, and it was actually to correlate or dovetail into this module for terrorist information. And the piece that I really wanted to emphasize again and again and again is that you take care of yourself, you take care of each other, you isolate and warn other folks, and you report by calling 911, probably in this area, is the most logical thing to do. Unless you have folks with hazardous materials capability that know how to decontaminate or how to care for folks, you don't want to involve yourself unless you have the personal protective equipment, the knowledge and skills, and the connections to go from start to finish, because once you start that process, you want to be able to finish that process safely. And generally, as Good Samaritans, you are not going to have that capability, but you can keep other people from going into harm's way. So, any questions about that video? All of those were incidents that have happened fairly recently, too. And indeed, there may be more of them before long. We just don't know. But we do know that citizen awareness has been an important factor in stopping some of those events from being carried to completion. And you have the capability, even though you're isolated by many standards, we don't know what's on the roadways going through on this highway. So, always be aware that you may be an inadvertent target just because they have a traffic accident and the materials they're carrying can harm you, those kinds of things. On page, let's see, 12, I believe it is. I'm looking for the shelter-in-place procedures.
Well,
On page 12. these shelter-in-place procedures were written for this terrorist event, but I'm thinking that sheltering in place actually works well for airborne contaminants from wildland fire, or if you should have some sort of an airborne hazardous material event on the highway. So very quickly, covering what's in your documentation there in your book, if you have a shelter-in-place situation, ideally, for the place that you're in, you already have your plastic and your duct tape ready to go. Remember all of that big flap about the duct tape and the plastic coverings and all that? It had to do with taking care of yourself in place. So you're covering up windows, doors, anywhere something from the outside can come in and get you, airborne preferably. But who's got that plastic sheeting and the duct tape ready? Not very many people. So if you have to do this quickly because there is a lot of airborne contaminant coming to you and you have an hour or so, you want to choose a room or an area in a room that you can block off. You can seal it basically from anything reaching you. But how long can you stay in that room? Think about it. You can stay in there as long as the air lasts, right? So that depends on how many people are in there with you. You can't have much of an airflow exchange without a lot of filtration because whatever's outside can come in and affect you. So you really want to be thinking about that if you're going to stay put. And you can have air purifiers, or unless you have additional oxygen concentrators or something, you're not going to be able to stay in there very long. So maybe 4 to 5 hours, breathing at a regular rate. So the information that's in your book is useful for those situations where you are definitely in harm's way and have to take immediate action. But they are not necessarily going to be things that you can use for the long term. And the other issue is, how do you seal off everything in a room like this? Very hard to do. We could do it in the restroom, though. We'd have sanitation supplies. We could take some food in there with us, and hopefully we'd have our radio to get good information about what's coming at us, right? But we couldn't stay there very long. So this is not a hugely practical situation, but it's a last-ditch situation, should you need to.
What I'm concerned about in a fire situation or a biological situation is we all have these little windmill thingies on our houses that ventilate our attics.
Mm-hmm.
How do you shut those off?
You can't.
How do you keep it from
Get on the roof and cover it with plastic and.
big fire comes, suck the cinders into your house and, you know,
That's where you have to do a cover or stop it in some way so that it's not drawing there.
They actually do make plastic covers like she's talking about, because I had one at my house down in the Pleasant Hill area. And in the winter time, we just put them on, it's like a big garbage bag with a string. Just put it on, tie them off. You talk about the turbines on the top.
Yeah.
But you're not going to do that at the last minute.
but if the fire will come.
Could.
It's just, you know, it's kind of one of those things I think about with a fire, embers in the air, you're just going to suck them right into your home. You might as well get 55.
Yeah, but they do make them there. It's a heavy plastic with a string, just a big bolt. And just put it over, tie them off.
How about an emergency blanket that's wet? You can use that. That hopefully doesn't burn the plastic bag if you're talking about fire safety. And various necessities, other information. Okay, so, moving on, let me do a little bit of review here. We covered some of this with the shelter in place and protection from fallout. I hope we didn't have an incident where we need to be protected from radioactive fallout, but time, distance, and shielding, meaning going deep behind walls or ceilings, cupboards, stay inside for a long amount of time, and also stay tuned with your portable radios. That's where the portable radio, if you can get a signal, which is difficult here, I know. And there again, you need to know about the hazard, and there your phone tree or your neighborhood grapevine work very, very well on taking care of each other and taking care of your neighbors. Has anyone ever had to be decontaminated? Ever gotten poison ivy, poison oak? same kinds of things. The decontamination procedure is used when you have a contaminant, something gets on you that you need to remove to protect life and limb. And the decontamination action is typically to flush with water, not to rub because that opens the pores, but just to flush and to push whatever is on your skin off of you. Blot yourself dry, report for decontamination, and I love that sentence because that presupposes that you have a major advanced life support hospital right here. If you don't, the best thing that you can do is flush that contaminant off, don't rub it, and then isolate yourself. Make sure that you get medical attention as soon as possible and report what happened to you, what it felt like, and what you think it was, if you can. And then also, of course, be aware of food safety as far as contaminants are concerned, because things getting into our food supply can be a terrorist activity as well. And sometimes that's done, you get the old salad bar thing where they sprinkle stuff on salads and so on. I hate to think of our world being like that. I like to think that we're all neighborly and helping one another, but there are folks who are out to do harm and want to do that to create havoc in our lives. So be aware of those kinds of things, that might be one avenue for terrorist activity.
You brought us snacks too, didn't you?
I did, but they were all packaged snacks and they were not injected with botulism, so you're okay.
That's not soap with donuts, though.
Yeah. So, I've said this several times, and there it is in bright red print. Personal safety is one of the major aspects of taking care of yourself as a CERT team member. You take your own self-protective actions, and you help other people. Don't try to treat people in a contaminated area. You want to move them away, get them to an area where they can flush or shower and get whatever contaminant off of them. And tell them about decontamination procedures, meaning that they need to go to the hospital or a clinic or at least be seen by medical personnel to be sure that their life is not in danger, that they won't have long-lasting effects from their exposure. And then the professional responders come in if they have the personal protective equipment to respond to a hazardous material event of that sort. Then they also want to know from you, how bad is it? How many people were affected? What kind of effects are you getting from it? What have you done so far? Where is the nearest medical aid? Who else can help us with responding to this or decontaminating? And that's where the basic knowledge of your community and the resources that you have available is really going to be hugely important and time critical. So, what I'd like to do is have you turn to, I believe, page 18. There's some scenarios there. And I'd just like to take a couple of minutes kind of to solidify this activity by working through this. So I would like you three to take scenario 1, and you to take 2, and you team up with her and take scenario 1, and 2, and then 1, this 3, and you 3 take scenario 2, and 1, down to Al, and Tara, all the way down to Rebecca, take 2. Okay. Just talk about yourselves, take 5 or 6 minutes, and say, what would you do? What would you do? What is it? What could it be? And then we'll have some answers in just a minute. Okay to talk. You can actually stand up in the corner or do whatever you want to do.
All right, and you ready? 1, yeah. So it's a bright spring day. You're stopping at the post office on your way home from work. As you enter the parking lot, you're shaken by an explosion, see glass from the post office windows fly through the air across the parking lot. Although it takes you a few seconds, you realize that there has been an explosion inside the post office. I don't know. I wouldn't be worrying about any kind of political motivations. I would be helping the people that were injured, or if there was smoke coming out of the building, I'd be running in looking for the source of the smoke or whatever. I don't know. I mean, that's what I'd be doing. And of course, if I had my phone on me, I'd call someone, yeah. Phone a friend. Phone a friend. But, I don't know. I don't know. I don't get paid enough to presuppose any, you know, I don't know. I'm just there to render aid, you know, regardless of what happened or why it happened, or I don't know. And if it was any of this NBC stuff, from my naval training, it's a losing situation. But anyway, so what would you do, Judy?
I don't know, call 911, stay over.
I mean, you're right next door most of the time.
Yeah, I'd be sitting in the office, coming to the wall.
But I don't know. I don't think. I don't know. It's like I said, it depends on the casualty. If you got somebody that's hurt, you'd be wanting an ambulance. If there was a fire, you'd be wanting a fire department.
Especially just watching the report.
I think people would just be coming to investigate it anyway. Well, yeah,
You just entered the parking lot.
you're coming up to get the mail at 4 o'clock.
Or you haven't got inside yet, so you wouldn't know if it was being, who was in there or what was, if it was, it's 5 o'clock, it's full.
Well, right, because from 4 to 3:30 to 4, the place is pretty packed.
Yeah, and usually has either a goal or
Could be somebody had mailing somebody was on something that they're, those lists they have on those not mail these items, maybe somebody just mailed somebody.
Or just maybe the hot water heater blew up.
Yeah.
That's more often than not.
No, I used to say we're watching, we're supposed to observe and report, we're not supposed to get in the way.
Well, render any aid that you could without,
But in case it was, because they said they usually.
You're not going to know if it was one of those if it was anything dangerous, like a chemical agent or something. You're not going to know unless when you have exposure to it.
Something else happens.
There's smoke coming out, and it's obviously not a fire smoke. It's got some kind of chemical smell, and you'd be probably running the other way. And doing like what you said, calling 911. There's this really bad, stinky, sour, rotten egg smell coming out of the post office, and there was an explosion.
Okay. You figured out what you do?
Oh no, we're trying to figure out what or different scenarios on that. But and then I don't know. It's up to.
Okay, I hear people talking about where they're going to have dinner, so I guess we're ready again.
The people, the dispatcher to decide what the
scenario number 1. So, who wants to volunteer to give a couple of things you would do? The 3 or 4 things you would do. You want to do it? Okay.
You get away from the area, and if it's possible, you watch the area for any suspicious people leaving, and then you alert the proper authorities, because if you go in after an explosion, you don't know if the instability of the walls is gonna have the whole building come down.
Or there's a secondary explosion.
Or there's a secondary explosion, or they have another agent with it, and then the police lose the rest of it.
Good. Any other, and take good notes, write stuff down. The hardest thing, and maybe David can add to this, but from having worked with our own sheriff's office in Humboldt County, eyewitnesses remember things differently. The sooner you write things down, what you remember, and stay with that and be able to turn that in to law enforcement, the better. Because don't trust your memory. I can't even trust my memory from room to room, much less 2 weeks later. So, okay, what about the others who have scenario one?